Краеугольная тень в пустыне.
Американцы играют в игры.
Слишком малый объект, чтобы беспокоиться.
It was 1981. The photograph was grainy, taken from a satellite orbiting 200 kilometers above the Nevada desert. In the briefing room of the Soviet Air Defense Forces headquarters in Moscow, a young intelligence analyst pointed at the dark, triangular shadow on the screen with growing excitement. His superior, a colonel with 3 decades of experience tracking American aircraft development, barely glanced at the image before dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Another experimental design that will never fly," he said, lighting a cigarette. "The Americans are always building prototypes. This is probably their 10th attempt at the supersonic reconnaissance plane." The room murmured in agreement. On the walls around them hung photographs of every major American aircraft: the sleek F-15 Eagle, the powerful F-14 Tomcat, the venerable B-52 Stratofortress. Each one had been studied, analyzed, and countered. Soviet air defense was the most sophisticated in the world, a layered fortress of radar stations, surface-to-air missiles, and interceptor aircraft that had turned the skies above the Warsaw Pact into an impenetrable dome. The analyst persisted. "Comrade Colonel, the shape is highly unusual. The angles are all wrong for aerodynamics. And look at the construction. It appears to be made of flat panels." The colonel exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Exactly. It will fly like a brick. The Americans have lost their minds chasing science fiction. A proper aircraft has curves, has wings that generate lift efficiently. This angular monstrosity violates every principle of aeronautical engineering." He was right, of course. On paper, the shape was absurd. The faceted design looked more like a child's geometric toy than a combat aircraft. Soviet aerospace engineers, some of the finest in the world, had already explored similar concepts in the 1960s and rejected them as impractical. An aircraft needed smooth curves to slice through the air efficiently. It needed traditional wings, a proper fuselage, and aerodynamic stability. This angular American experiment appeared to have none of these things. What the colonel and his team didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the Americans weren't trying to build a better fighter. They were trying to build an invisible one. The soul of Soviet air defense doctrine was simple: detect, track, engage, destroy. It was a system perfected over decades, refined through painful lessons learned in World War II and the Cold War skies. Their radar network was a marvel. From the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, thousands of early warning radars scanned the skies continuously. These were backed by tracking radars that could follow multiple targets simultaneously, and fire control radars that guided missiles with deadly precision. The SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, and the newer SA-10 missile systems created overlapping kill zones that stretched from ground level to the edge of space. Soviet strategists were confident. American aircraft were fast and sophisticated, yes, but they were also large, metal, and reflective. They lit up Soviet radar screens like Christmas trees. An F-15 Eagle, for all its speed and agility, had a radar cross-section the size of a small car. A B-52 bomber might as well have been broadcasting its location with a loudspeaker. The equation was simple. If you could see it, you could kill it. And Soviet radar could see everything. When intelligence reports about the mysterious angular aircraft, codenamed Senior Trend by the Americans, began filtering through GRU channels, the response was methodical skepticism. The reports were filed, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed based on 3 core assumptions. First, the radar invisibility theory was physics fiction. Soviet radar engineers were among the best in the world. They understood electromagnetic wave propagation better than almost anyone. While it was theoretically possible to reduce an aircraft's radar signature through careful shaping and special materials, making a combat-capable aircraft truly invisible to radar was considered impossible. The aircraft would have to be so carefully designed, so precisely constructed, that any practical payload or combat capability would be sacrificed. It would be a flying laboratory, not a weapon. Second, even if the Americans somehow achieved reduced visibility, it wouldn't matter. Soviet air defense was layered and redundant. If one radar frequency couldn't detect a target, another would. If radar failed, infrared sensors would pick up the heat signature of the engines. If those failed, human observers with binoculars and sound detectors would spot the aircraft. The idea that something could slip through this entire network was laughable. Third, the performance trade-offs would be fatal. To achieve this supposed stealth, the Americans would have to sacrifice speed, maneuverability, payload capacity, and range. What good was an invisible aircraft if it couldn't carry weapons, couldn't defend itself, and couldn't fly fast enough to escape if detected? The Soviet MiG-29 and Su-27 interceptors could fly at Mach 2. This angular brick would probably struggle to reach Mach 1. The reports were filed away. The production lines for SA-10 missiles continued to hum. Soviet radar operators continued their vigilant watch, confident that nothing could penetrate their electronic fortress. They had no idea they were already blind. While Soviet analysts were confidently dismissing the angular aircraft as an aerodynamic failure, something extraordinary was happening in the black world of American aerospace development. The engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works weren't trying to build a faster plane or a more maneuverable plane. They were trying to answer a question that had haunted American war planners since Vietnam. How do you strike a heavily defended target without losing aircraft? The answer came from an unlikely source, a Russian scientist. In 1966, Pyotr Ufimtsev, a Soviet physicist, had published a paper on the theory of electromagnetic wave scattering. It was dense, mathematical work that most considered purely academic. The Soviet military establishment dismissed it as having no practical application. The paper was even published openly, considered so irrelevant that it didn't need to be classified. American scientists at DARPA read it, and they understood something the Soviets had missed. Ufimtsev had provided the mathematical framework for predicting exactly how radar waves would reflect off complex surfaces. With this knowledge, you could theoretically design an aircraft shape that would scatter radar energy in every direction except back toward the receiver. The result was the F-117 Nighthawk, the angular, faceted aircraft that Soviet analysts had photographed and dismissed. Every surface was angled precisely to deflect radar waves away from the source. The aircraft had no curves, no right angles facing forward, no smooth surfaces that could create a strong radar return. It was covered in a special radar-absorbent material that soaked up electromagnetic energy like a sponge. Even the engine intakes were hidden behind a fine metal mesh that allowed air in but prevented radar waves from reaching the highly reflective turbine blades. The trade-offs were real. The F-117 was subsonic. It couldn't outrun anything. It was unstable and required a sophisticated fly-by-wire computer system to keep it in the air. It couldn't carry external weapons because they would ruin its radar signature. It couldn't dogfight. It had no guns, no air-to-air missiles, no ability to defend itself in combat. But none of that mattered, because the F-117 wasn't designed to fight. It was designed to slip past the enemy air defenses completely unseen, deliver precision-guided bombs to high-value targets, and disappear back into the night before anyone knew it was there. The Americans had built an assassin, not a warrior. Throughout the 1980s, Soviet air defense forces continued to modernize based on a fundamental assumption. They would see the enemy coming. New radar systems were deployed. The SA-12 and SA-15 missiles joined the arsenal. Billions of rubles poured into perfecting the art of detection and interception. Fighter regiments practiced scrambling against high-speed threats. Missile crews drilled endlessly on tracking fast-moving targets. Meanwhile, American intelligence carefully monitored Soviet capabilities, and they noticed something remarkable. The Soviets were preparing to fight yesterday's war. Every improvement, every advancement, every new system was designed to counter conventional aircraft. Faster planes, more maneuverable planes, aircraft flying higher or lower or carrying more electronic countermeasures. The F-117 program remained one of the most tightly guarded secrets in American history. The aircraft flew only at night from a remote base in Nevada. Even within the US military, only a handful of people knew the full capabilities of the Black Jet. Soviet satellites occasionally caught glimpses, but the intelligence analysis always reached the same conclusion. An experimental aircraft, probably unstable, probably impractical, certainly nothing to worry about. The Soviet assessment wasn't stupid. It was based on sound engineering principles and decades of experience. Stealth, as the Americans called it, seemed to violate basic physics and common sense. How could something as large as a fighter aircraft simply disappear from radar? The answer, which would remain hidden until the moment of revelation, was that it didn't disappear. It just became as small as a bird. The F-117's radar cross-section was approximately 0.003 square meters. By comparison, a conventional fighter aircraft might be 10 to 20 square meters. On a radar screen, where controllers expected to see a bright blip representing an incoming aircraft, the F-117 appeared as nothing more than random noise, a slight irregularity that might be a bird, or weather, or just electronic static. Radar operators were trained to filter out such noise. They were looking for real targets, not shadows. The human eye sees what it expects to see. The mind discards what seems impossible. The F-117 was designed to exploit this psychology as much as the physics of radar.
The confrontation didn't happen over the Baltic, or the Bering Strait, or any of the Cold War flashpoints where Soviet and American forces stared at each other across invisible lines. It happened on January 17, 1991, at 2:51 a.m. Baghdad time. The opening hours of Operation Desert Storm began not with a massive bomber strike, not with waves of fighters, but with a ghost attack. 10 F-117 Nighthawks, flying in complete radio silence, slipped across the Saudi-Iraqi border under cover of darkness. Iraq's air defense system was Soviet-trained, Soviet-equipped, and Soviet-doctrined. It was one of the densest and most sophisticated in the world, a miniature version of the defensive fortress the Soviets had built around Moscow. Baghdad was ringed with radar stations, SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 missile batteries, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns. Iraqi air defense officers had been trained at Soviet academies. They knew their business. Their radar screens showed nothing unusual. A few random returns, the normal electronic noise of a sky at night. Then downtown Baghdad began to explode. The first bombs struck with surgical precision. A telecommunications center vanished in a flash. A command bunker's roof was pierced by a laser-guided bomb that went through the ventilation shaft. The presidential palace, the Ba'ath Party headquarters, the Air Defense Coordination Center. One after another, critical targets were destroyed by weapons that seemed to fall from empty sky. Iraqi radar operators frantically scanned their screens. There was nothing there. No aircraft signatures, no warning. Just explosions blooming across the city. One panicked operator broke radio discipline. "They're bombing us! Where are they? I see nothing!"
The response from his commander was equally bewildered. "There's nothing on radar. Keep scanning." For the Iraqi defenders, it was a nightmare. For the Soviet military advisors who had helped build and train this air defense system, it was an existential crisis. Their entire philosophy of warfare, their entire technological approach, had just been rendered obsolete. The F-117s had flown through the heart of the world's sixth-largest air defense network as if it didn't exist. Of the 1,299 combat sorties flown by F-170s during Desert Storm, not one was shot down. Not one was damaged by enemy fire. The aircraft that didn't exist, that couldn't fly, that violated basic aerodynamics, had achieved a perfect operational record against defenses specifically designed to counter American air power. The angular joke from 1981 had become a killing machine that rewrote the rules of air warfare. The reports that reached Moscow in early 1991 were met first with disbelief, then with growing horror. Soviet aerospace engineers pulled out their old studies on radar cross-section reduction. The work of Pyotr Ufimtsev, published openly, dismissed as academic theory, was suddenly understood in its full, terrible significance. The Americans hadn't just read his paper. They had built an entire aircraft around its principles. They had taken Soviet theoretical work and turned it into a weapon that made Soviet air defenses functionally blind. The irony was devastating. The mathematical foundation for stealth technology had originated in the Soviet Union. But the Soviet system, rigid, hierarchical, risk-averse, had dismissed it as impractical. The American system, chaotic, competitive, willing to fund crazy ideas, had turned it into the most revolutionary aircraft since the jet engine. Emergency programs were launched to develop counter-stealth radars, lower-frequency systems that might be able to detect stealth aircraft at the cost of reduced accuracy, infrared search and track systems that could spot the heat signature of engines, passive radar that listened for disturbances in commercial radio and television signals. But these were band-aids on a sucking chest wound. The problem wasn't just the F-117. The problem was that an entire pillar of Soviet military power, air defense, had been undermined. If the Americans could build one stealth aircraft, they could build more. Stealth bombers, stealth cruise missiles, an entire invisible air force. The Soviet Union had spent decades and hundreds of billions of rubles building an air defense network designed to counter visible threats. That entire investment had just been rendered obsolete by a triangular aircraft that flew at subsonic speeds and carried only 2 bombs. The Cold War arms race had always been about action and reaction, thrust and counter-thrust. The Soviets built missiles. America built missile defense. America built bombers. The Soviets built interceptors. But stealth was different. Stealth wasn't just a new weapon. It was a new category of warfare that bypassed the entire Soviet defensive philosophy. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, American stealth technology had expanded far beyond the F-117. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was already operational, capable of carrying massive payloads deep into enemy territory. Work had begun on what would become the F-22 Raptor, a stealth fighter that sacrificed nothing, fast, maneuverable, and invisible. The final verdict was mathematical and merciless. F-117 combat record, 1,299 sorties, 0 losses to enemy fire, 0 damage from enemy air defenses. Iraqi air defense effectiveness against stealth aircraft, effectively 0%. The dismissive laugh from that Moscow briefing room in 1981 had been transformed into a horrified silence. The physics fiction had become physics fact. The impractical experiment had become the future of air warfare. The mystery had been solved, but the answer was a death sentence for Soviet military doctrine. You cannot shoot down what you cannot see. And if you cannot shoot it down, you cannot defend anything. The legacy of the invisible. The F-117 Nighthawk was retired from service in 2008, replaced by more advanced stealth platforms. But its legacy remains written into the very structure of modern warfare. The lesson of the stealth fighter wasn't just about radar cross-sections and electromagnetic scattering. It was about the nature of innovation itself. The Soviets had built a magnificent fortress of air defense based on the principle of detection. It was logical, well-engineered, and fundamentally sound, as long as the enemy played by the rules they expected. When the Americans changed the rules entirely, the fortress became a prison of obsolete thinking. Soviet engineers were brilliant. Soviet scientists were world-class. But the Soviet system was incapable of taking the kind of radical risk that the F-117 represented. The idea of building an aircraft that looked like it couldn't fly, that violated every established principle of aerodynamics, that required a completely new manufacturing process and millions of dollars in research with no guarantee of success, such a project would have been killed in committee before it ever left the drawing board. The Americans built it anyway, not because they knew it would work, but because they were willing to find out. In the end, the mystery of the F-117 was the mystery of two different civilizations approaching the same problem. One looked at radar and asked, "How do we build better radar?" The other looked at radar and asked, "How do we make radar useless?" One answer led to incremental improvement. The other led to revolution. The angular aircraft that Soviet analysts had photographed and dismissed in 1981 had been asking a question they never thought to consider. What if the sky itself could hide you? The answer, delivered in the darkness over Baghdad from an aircraft that didn't appear on any radar screen, was the real end of the Soviet Union's claim to military technological parity. They had laughed at the angles. They had dismissed the impossibility. They had filed away the reports and continued building better radar. And somewhere in the Nevada desert, an angular black aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly was proving that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting for someone crazy enough to try it. The F-117 didn't win the Cold War, but it revealed which side was willing to question everything, risk everything, and build something that shouldn't exist. In warfare, as in life, that willingness to embrace the impossible is often the difference between victory and obsolescence. The phantom had been there all along. They just couldn't see it.